Funding for this program was provided in part by the Division of Continuing Education at Brigham Young University.
Welcome to another roundtable discussion of the Doctrine and Covenants. My name is Matthew Richardson, Associate Dean of Religious Education at Brigham Young University. I'm joined today by my colleagues from the Department of Church History and Doctrine, also at Brigham Young University. Seated across directly from me is Dean Garrett. Welcome, Dean.
Thank you, Matt. It's good to be with you today.
It's a pleasure to have you here. We also have John Livingston. Welcome, John.
Good to be here today, too.
And finally, we have Craig Minsell. Craig, welcome.
Thanks for the invitation.
It's nice to have you, brethren, here. Today in our study, we will be studying Doctrine and Covenants, sections 102, 104, and 106. Just a quick explanation of why that order is taking place is we decided to cover sections 101, 103, and 105 in a previous session simply because it fit well with the Zion concept and redeeming Zion in Missouri. So these concepts here might seem a little smattered, but we see some interesting principles. Let's start with section 102 that deals with the High Council and how a High Council operates. We find in the opening line here, it talks about the minutes rather than just a revelation, the minutes of the organization of the first High Council of the Church. And Craig, why don't you give us a framework to work on with this section?
If you could give a title to this section, you might call it the Constitution of a High Council.
Oh, that's interesting.
But at this time, we're familiar with the term High Council and High Counselors speakers in a sacrament meeting. But at this time, there was no High Council that had been organized, and so there were some difficulties in the Kirtland area, and they needed to be addressed, in a fair way. And so Joseph Smith this is a meeting, and there are minutes from the meeting held on February 17th of 1834, and the minutes are about how to organize this council. It's going to be called a standing council or something like a stake high council. So that's what this is about, how to proceed to take care of difficulties within a
And I think that
stake.
this is important. I'm glad that you brought this up to frame it in this sense, is to take care of difficulties. Sometimes when we think of High Council, we just think they come and visit the Lord and give a talk, and it's the High Council Sunday. But obviously, as you mentioned, and I like this, is what's taking place here is there's more at hand here. And they do have responsibility with taking care of difficulties or perhaps resolving difficulties. I think that's important.
Mm-hmm. It's clear that they are a council, a high council, a bishop's council is mentioned. It's probably important to point out that, counselors to a bishop are actually spelled differently. They're there to counsel. We really don't see the councilmen thing. They are counselors, Councilors.
Mm-hmm.
They are a council.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
Now, it's also worthy to note that at this time, the Quorum of the 12 hadn't been organized. So, this council will function within the Kirtland area. Later, we'll learn about the organization of the Quorum of the 12 or the traveling.
Which would be in about a year, right?
Yeah,
It was
right.
1835.
So this council sort of precedes the calling of the 12.
And gives it some type of administrative structure within the time period.
One of the things that also administratively in this one here that we need to pick up on is in verse 9 where it says the president of the church, who is also the president of the council. Joseph was functioning both as the president of the church and also in Kirtland, the president of the stake.
Sort of like the stake
president
yeah.
in Kirtland. So therefore he would be president of this council. And that's why you see him as the president of the council, because he's also the president of the stake in that sense.
Right. Now, if we were to cut to the chase on this, is when we say dealing with disruptions or problems, this is a notion of often dealing with transgression, helping individuals to be able to resolve those situations under an administrative authority. Now, the way I understand it, when we talk about councils being held, especially what one might term as a disciplinary council, the main purpose of those council is, number one, is to save the soul of the transgressors. I think that is pretty well clear. This is to be able to help save souls, and then number two is to protect the innocent, and then number three, of course, is to safeguard the purity, the integrity of the church. And that's not an easy thing always to do, but it should be at the forefront. And I think that we see this being laid out here is how one administratively goes about. Is that, would you agree with that?
And I think really, if you look at verse 2, it talks about how serious a high council, disciplinary council is. Right in the middle of verse 2, for the purpose of settling important difficulties which might arise in the church, which could not be settled by the church or the bishop's council. And so really, things that come before a high council are very serious.
Yeah, and have apparently already been to a bishop and worked through the appropriate means as we go through there. Well, it might be helpful just quickly to look through of how this happens, because there's no doubt about it, as Craig was mentioning, this is organizing this, of how this will work. And there are some logistics, but yet they are interesting logistics of how this would take place in doing, as John read in verse 2, settling important difficulties which might arise.
Sometimes individuals who come before a high council, disciplinary council, have clear-cut issues and the case isn't too tough, in which case it appears that just a couple of people are going to address the issues. What is that, about verse 13, if it's difficult or not, if it is not, two of the counselors, and again that's CIL counselors, shall speak upon it according to the form above written. If it's more difficult, look at verse 14. How many then?
Up to 6.
Yeah, it can be 4 or 6. And in 17, the high counselors actually draw lots. I can remember as a young high counselor being involved in my first disciplinary council when the clerk came around, he had an envelope and we took numbers. I wasn't quite sure what that was all about. But as I reviewed section 102, I learned that there was an order, and those who draw the even numbers are to really make sure that the individual who's before the council, their interests are cared for, and those who had the odd numbers, why, they were to stand up for the interests of the church.
So there's no misunderstanding. Let's just go on the basic. Is how many members are in the high council established at this time?
12.
And so that's important. So we look at the 12, and then we start to see that division as John was talking about.
Yeah, verse 17 says it so well, where it says, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and 12 are the individuals who are to stand up in behalf of the accused and prevent insult and injustice.
So what would the others do?
Those others, it would seem, are to make sure that the interests of the church
That's right.
are looked at and taken care of.
Interest of the church, interest of the doctrine of the church. It's that notion, once again, is the purity and the integrity and the good name of the church. And so it's the thing I like about this is, once again, is the notion of being able to make sure that we're taking care of all sides to be fair in being able to take care of things appropriately.
I find it really interesting that the Lord would is so concerned about somebody who has committed serious sin and has confessed that sin and come before a council, that they are protected and their rights are protected, and that's the responsibility of these men, that they make sure that person is treated kindly and lovingly and with proper respect and rights.
And I like that, what you just said, because it gives a sense as it's not someone's out to get you. It's not looking to put you in the clink or to take away its punitive experience. Justice will be served, but in a way, brothers, I think what happens here is we get the spirit of what happens, for me at least, throughout the entire Doctrine and Covenants, is the role of an advocate, of coming forth to look to find reasons to save a soul. And often that is through justice must be served. Repentance, complete repentance can take place, but it's done in a way which is appropriate to the church, to the individual, and also to protect the innocent of some who might be involved with that individual if they weren't taken care of.
I think it's interesting, too, that even though you may have a maximum of only half the council, 6 people speaking, look at verse 20 here. But should the remaining counselors who have not spoken, or any one of them, after hearing the evidences and pleadings impartially, discover an error in the decision of the president, they can manifest it, and the case shall have a rehearing. Right. It's almost as if these brethren are being cautioned to be very careful here. And he says it in verse 21. If, after a careful rehearing, any additional light is shown upon the case, the decision shall be altered accordingly.
Also in this, you've brought out a good point in verse 20. Who makes the decision? Is it the high council themselves, or is it the president who's in charge? Who's, going to make the ruling?
Clearly, it's the
president. It's his decision. After he's heard everything that's been said, and he will counsel with his counselors, and then it will be his decision with the Lord in prayer.
And what happens, though, if that decision is something that doesn't sit well, or there is something of an appeal? Too bad. Is that set up? Is the buck stops with the High Council? Does that make sense?
Check verse 27.
That's right, okay.
There we go. Should the parties or either of them be dissatisfied with the decision of the said council, which is the High Council, of course, they may appeal to the High Council of the seat of the first presidency of the church.
And have a rehearing, which case shall be therefore conducted.
Yeah.
Good.
And later on, of course, if you come down to 31, from the decision of the former, which is the High Council, there can be an appeal, but from the decision of the latter, there cannot.
Well, you're familiar with the Striplings of Milk story with Thomas B. Marsh. That was appealed all the way to the president of the church, or to be heard there in that council, rather than in the High Council, and that was in the Far West period. So this was being employed throughout the church in the early days, as it is today. This is the Constitution for a High Council, a handbook of instructions for them.
Dean?
Well, in the church then and now, there's really 3 levels of council. Your bishop has a council where
Right.
people can come before him, and they can appeal that to a High Council, and then they could appeal that from the High Council to the First Presidency Council. But as we just mentioned, the First Presidency Council is the final word on the decision, and so this applies so well to what we do today in the church, and we follow this very carefully in what we do today in the church.
As a matter of fact, whenever someone is disciplined in a way that they're excommunicated or disfellowshipment, the information does go on to the office of the First Presidency. So in a sense, all of these do move on, even though there may not be an appeal. The First Presidency bears the responsibility ultimately for decisions made by High Councils.
Verse 30 really applies to what you're saying here. There is a distinction between the High Council and the traveling High Council. The traveling High Priest abroad and the traveling High Council, composed of who? 12 apostles. And so that's what you're saying, the highest level, and that's what moves on to them, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
And that's a good point. And once again, I hope the flavor comes out is the notion of trying to be able to save souls. Is the intent of this is to bring to pass the opportunities to come closer to Christ, to do whatever's necessary. John, you mentioned even in the case of such of excommunication, I know that if that is the decision, then there is a healthy set of steps to be able to help one to come back if they would desire. It's not just you're out, be gone, but it's a notion of this is in consequence of, and here's how one may come back, and we hope to have the reconvening of a council, which they would do to reinstate, of that same High Council to see if conditions were met.
I think most of us have probably served on High Councils, haven't we? And as we sit in those disciplinary councils, what a heavy responsibility that is, but by the same token, what a feeling of love and an outpouring there is. Every one of us sit there and almost feel like, gosh, but for, a few things in life, I suppose I could have made mistakes like that. It's a very careful thing.
Usually that decision that's made by the president, it's a unanimous feeling by everyone there, including the accused. He feels like he's justly been handled. That's been my experience.
Well, thank you. Let's take a look at section 104. April of 1834. We're moving along. This one has a lot to do with concepts that were introduced early within church organization, the concept of consecration, stewardship, order, etc. Dean, if you would, will you frame this section for us before our discussion?
As you just mentioned, consecration was given to the saints in section 42, and from that time, there were approaches taken, and the Lord told them how consecration of temporal things, especially, was to be done. And they had, because you had Kirtland and you had Zion and 2 different bishops and so on, they had at one point had a method of consecration being practiced in Kirtland, and also it being practiced in Zion. Then that was all combined under one head. Now, because of the difficulties that's existing in Zion, and also probably some things that's happening in Kirtland, the Lord has given the revelation here to dissolve that method of living consecration. And so when you look at the section, you begin with verse 20 and 19 and 20, individuals now will be given stewardships with private responsibility and will be taken out of the common approach that they were having at that time, and so they were now going to be responsible. And the Lord, before He gives them their own stewardships, and takes it out of the consecration, he teaches some very, very important principles that really apply to us today in the first part of this section. So this section becomes extremely important for us, even though it's being framed in that dissolution of the United Order consecration that they were living.
Now, if I understood you correctly, and I think this is an important point, is we're not dissolving the principles of consecration,
No.
nor the principles of stewardship therewith, but it's almost the temporal handling of those, because there was such debt going on, is restructuring that in such a way where, as I recall, Joseph would be in a position where he could go to what they would call Zion's camp. And some people, I think, the reason I bring that up is they feel that what's happening here, I guess we don't have consecration anymore, which of course is not right.
There is a law of consecration which we are under today.
That is correct.
As much as they were then.
Excellent.
Yeah, this revelation is more a part of an outcome of being expelled from Jackson County, Missouri. Therefore, it left the United Order. What are we going to do with this order? The law of consecration as we move on. There's property and storehouses, and how do we disperse that again and bring it back into private ownership or into the church? So
Good, and I think that when you look at some of the principles, Dean, you were talking about that are here in verse 1, it does talk about establishing a united order and an everlasting order for the benefit of the church.
Yes.
The principles are everlasting. And we see a reordering of perhaps the practice of that principle therewith. And verse 2 it opens an interesting concept dealing with, I think, Zion living or disciples living. It says here that I give a promise, it's unchangeable, that they were, in verse 2 it says, I commanded were faithful, that they should be blessed with the multiplicity of blessings. I've always wondered exactly what that means, but boy, it's beyond my scope. But here it comes down is it talks about this notion of entering into covenants and having these blessings. Verse 3, but inasmuch as they were not faithful, they were nigh unto cursings. And the reason I bring that up is sometimes we get the notion of, okay, if I'm faithful, if I do commandment A, I get blessing A. If I don't do commandment A, then I don't get blessing A. So, you know what, I don't really want blessing A, so I might as well not do it. But when one enters under these covenants, it's true, you don't get blessing A, but also it says here,
You get a cursing.
you get a cursing.
Because I'm under covenant to do commandment A. Whether I want to do it or not, I'm still under covenant to do commandment A.
That's right, and this is a higher order in that sense, as we become disciples of a higher order, where it says in verse 4, I have cursed them with a very sore and grievous curse of breaking
And
covenants.
notice why, because they have broken the covenant through covetousness and with feigned words.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
what does feigned words mean, do you think?
Empty, not
Empty
real
words.
That's
intent,
right.
Yeah,
without intent.
Right.
I also think of, here's an interesting concept, vain. Not as in vanity as far as that goes, but vain with no power. And isn't that interesting, as in the early days of don't take up the name of the Lord God in vain or feigned words with empty promises. When you're a covenant partaker, we make certain promises, a multiplicity of blessings, however we frame that, but also understanding if we break our covenants, we will not only not receive those blessings, but a grievous curse.
See in verse 6, I, the Lord, am not to be mocked.
Yeah,
That's a pretty severe warning.
that is.
We really learned from the Book of Mormon that a curse is simply to be cut off from the Lord. If your spiritual radar is suddenly gone and you're sort of having to feel your way through life in a mortal way, Alma 3 talks about every man brings upon himself his own curse. And when we're cut off from the Lord, spiritual death is the ultimate, being cut off from the Lord. But cursings, sometimes people will think about swearing or cursing or to be heavily condemned, but just simply to have the influence or the spirit withdrawn is a significant curse.
Excuse me, go ahead, Larry.
Look at the consequence of what you're talking about in verse 9. Is that where you're going, Matt? Inasmuch as ye are cut off for the transgression, you cannot escape the buffetings of Satan until the day of redemption. So one of the consequences is the buffetings of Satan being turned over to him. And who would want that?
And so when we talk about this notion of covenants, and you mentioned being responsible for your own self, every man to himself, it's an individual responsibility. And then we start talking in verse 12 about stewardships. And it says, every man, verse 13, is expedient that I, the Lord, should make every man accountable as a steward over earthly things. And it's my purpose that I shall, in verse 15, provide for my saints, for all things are mine. But I'm giving you a steward. And, the very notion of steward, it comes from that old English of styward, and and to be quite graphic, it's the keeper of the sty or the keeper of the pigs.
Yeah.
They're not your pigs, but you act as if they're yours, and you keep them. Your salvation. You know, isn't that interesting
is
here?
interesting.
And I'm going to give you. It's mine, but I give you the chance.
The key to understanding his expectations of us when it comes to temporal material things is we don't own a cotton picking thing. It's his.
That's
Everything
what
is
verse
his.
14 says
Yes.
that, right at the
And
end.
so
All
just-
things
All
therein
things are
mine, yeah.
his, and we don't own anything, and we're therefore as stewards. Now, that being the case, he's going to hold us accountable to what we do with it. And he has certain ideas of what he wants us to do with it. We have our agency to or not to, but we still are going to be held accountable for what we do with our material things as well as our time, talents, and energies.
And that holds true to almost everything.
Everything.
I mean, all of us being parents is that great stewardship, knowing that they're just ours for a brief moment, but yet we have a greater responsibility to a Father in heaven who has given us an opportunity to, and I don't mean this in a crass way, but to be etymologically precise, to be keepers of those pigs, so to speak. They're not mine, but I am a steward, keeper of the
I
sty.
think those of us who have had the blessing of serving a mission, and every few weeks you met with the president, and you kind of gave an accounting.
Oh, that's good.
There's a wonderful pattern there, and sooner or later it may be the Lord that we sit down and do the accounting with.
Might not be me, I think it is.
And, you know, as a mission president, when I held those interviews, I wasn't holding those interviews to condemn or to check up or anything like that. I held those interviews to help and to lift and try
Good.
to lift it. And you'll notice in verse 14, that's why he's done everything he's done for us. It's his. He stretched out the heavens and built the earth. My very handiwork and all things mine. And that's my purpose to bring for my saints. For all things are mine. It's for us that he's done it.
And then he reminds us, Dean, in 17, that the earth is full and there is enough to spare. And so as we're being turned back over to our own agency with our own stewardship now, with our consecration of ourselves back to the church, there's plenty to go around.
There's plenty. And then verse 16, it has to be done his way. We can
Yes,
create our
that's
own
his
creative
way.
ways of providing and helping others, but it has to be done his way because he has a purpose in doing it his way. His purpose is to help his children become like him. So it has to be done his way because he wants to provide for the saints so that the poor will be exalted and the rich will be made whole. He wants both groups with him, not just one or the other. He wants both groups
And his
with
way
him.
is, now would be fast offerings, for example. That's his way that we might be able to care for the poor.
Yes, very much so.
What happens now is then we go through and understanding that, starting in verse 19, for example, then he'll give stewardships to individuals.
Right,
For
that's
example,
where it's
Sidney
at.
Rigdon in verse 20, Martin Harris 24, Frederick G. Williams in verse 27, Oliver Cowdery 28,
Martin
John
Harris.
Johnson, etc. It just goes through and it lists these stewardship. Newell K. Whitney in 39, and then Joseph Smith Jr. in verse 43. And the commandment there, as Dean was mentioning in the introduction in verses 47 and 48, is we're restructuring the way that we're going to practice the temporal order of consecration and stewardship. And maybe we should...
Verse 47 is a good one to talk about
Okay.
that. And now a commandment I give unto you concerning Zion, that you shall no longer be bound as a united order to your brethren of Zion, only on this wise.
And that wise, notice it doesn't take away completely, but it's the united order of the stake of Zion, united
Right.
order of the stake of...
That's
It's,
in 48.
it's almost like a stewardship, be giving in the individual element to practice the principle.
And the principle that he's got to remind every one of these brethren when they receive that stewardship, he takes them back. If you go back to verse 18, there's a principle and a warning. I don't like verse 18. I think it applies to everybody, but when it applies to me, I struggle with verse 18. If any man, and that's very descriptive, if any man shall take of the abundance which I have made and impart not his portion according to my law of the gospel, and to the poor and the needy, he shall with the wicked lift up his eyes in hell, being in torment.
Well, that sure made us all a little
That
uncomfortable.
just,
Thanks,
yeah,
Dean.
That's a
that just
warning
kind of, that's a very, but that's a real warning,
You
is
know-
that with being stewards over his
That's right,
things.
I wonder too. You know, we live in a country that is rich and wealthy. As communications open up, and we can see in the evening news at any time, we have countries in the world that are poor. I often wonder if we have a responsibility, and of course in the church, through humanitarian services and others, we really are trying to reach out to others and to bless them. I think we need to realize that this rich, poor thing in the eyes of the Lord is a very serious issue.
Well, reach out and bless them. Maybe we should end here, verse 59, at least on this section. For the purpose of building up my church and kingdom on the earth, to prepare my people for the time when I shall dwell with them, which is, by the way, nigh at hand. And with that in mind, nigh at hand, which is nigh at hand, then we come over to section 106, which was given to Warren A. Caldry, of course, who is the brother of Oliver Caldry. And he was called to preside over the saints in Freedom in New York, and maybe similar to what we might call a mission president, so to speak, at the time. But anyway, what we look up here is this notion of nigh at hand, once again, is preparing and devoting for when the time of the Lord will come. Thoughts on this section in section 106?
Well, he certainly, look at verse 3, devote his whole time to this high and holy calling. Here's the Lord referring to this responsibility as a high priest, responding over as a high and holy calling. Seek diligently.
And so here's the high and holy calling, and then it comes down and says in the last part of verse 3 is, for the laborer is worthy of his hire. There's the calling, is now I want you to match the message,
Yes.
which is not easy.
That's true.
And then, of course, here's the nigh unto, is when do we know it's coming? It's coming, it says, is it's nigh, and it'll overtake the world as a thief in the night. Then verse 5, this is an interesting concept. Therefore, gird up your loins. And sometimes I think we think of girding up the loins as flexing. Okay, I'm ready for the head. It's coming. And some people have a connotation of the coming of the Lord as such a dreadful day. Okay. But yet we look at for example, in the New Testamental connotation of girding up the loins was tying up around their waist so that they could bend over and work, run, go to work.
Ready to go to work.
Maybe it would be in our connotation, rolling up our sleeves. So here I come. Be worthy of the calling, verse 5. Therefore, roll up your sleeves so that you may be children of light. Thoughts on children of light, quickly?
Well, I find it interesting that here to the world, to those who are not prepared, he's going to come as a thief. And how does a thief come in the night?
Using the back door.
Yeah, use the back door. We usually leave it unlocked for him because he's not going to come. But when the Lord comes, he's going to come and when we're least expected him. But for the children of light, those who will follow the prophets of God and are prepared, he will come. He will not overtake us as a thief in the night. We'll be prepared for his coming, no matter when it is.
They're faithful members and they're watching.
That's right.
Yeah,
They're not
they're
kept
watching.
in the dark.
They're not in the dark.
And here we come to the conclusion, verse 8. I give him grace and assurance wherewith he may stand, and if he continue to be faithful witness and a light unto the church, I have prepared a crown. Children of light I prepared, I give you grace. Brethren, thank you for your help in understanding these sections and at least getting us on a start to where we can go for further study. It's been a pleasure.
Visit our website to find out more about the Doctrine and Covenants. Go to byubroadcasting.org. Funding for this program was provided in part by the Division of Continuing Education at Brigham Young University.